The cold bit through Elena's thin coat as she walked down another unfamiliar street. She had lost count of how many corners she'd turned, how many faces had looked past her like she was invisible. 3 days in Vienna, and the city felt more foreign than ever. Her stomach had stopped growling hours ago. Now it just ached. A constant reminder that she hadn't eaten anything real since that half-eaten sandwich she'd found near a park bench yesterday morning. The shame of that moment still burned in her chest, but hunger has a way of pushing shame aside. Elena pulled her coat tighter and kept walking. The evening crowds rushed past her, briefcases swinging, high heels clicking against cobblestones. Everyone seemed to know exactly where they were going. Everyone belonged somewhere except her. She thought about her grandmother's house back in the village. The kitchen always smelled like fresh bread and herbs. There was always soup on the stove, always a place at the table. That world felt like a dream now, something that had happened to someone else. The war had swallowed it whole, along with everything and everyone she loved. The photograph in her pocket was the only proof that life had ever existed. She touched it through the fabric, feeling its worn edges. Her grandmother at the old piano, smiling at whoever was taking the picture. Elena had been maybe 7 or 8 years old, standing beside her, tiny hands stretched across the keys. A gust of wind made her stumble. Her head felt light, disconnected from her body. She knew this feeling. It was the same one she'd had the second day without food, back when she was still hiding in that basement with the others, waiting for the shelling to stop. The street opened into a small square, and warm light spilled out from a building ahead. Through the large windows she could see people sitting at tables, laughing, eating. The glow looked almost magical against the darkening sky. She watched a waiter carry a tray of pastries past the window, golden and perfect. Elena's feet moved before her mind could stop them. She crossed the square, drawn toward the warmth like a moth to flame. The door was heavy, solid wood with brass handles that gleamed under the streetlights. She put her hand on the cold metal and pushed. Heat rushed over her face. The sudden warmth made her dizzy. She steadied herself against the doorframe and looked around. Crystal chandeliers hung from painted ceilings. White tablecloths covered every surface. The people inside wore clothes that probably cost more than her family had made in a month, maybe a year. The smell hit her next. Fresh bread, coffee, something sweet and buttery that made her mouth water instantly. Her knees went weak. A man in a black suit appeared in front of her, his face tight with concern. Not the good kind of concern, the kind that wanted her gone. He said something in rapid German, words she only half understood. But his meaning was clear. This place wasn't for people like her. She should leave. She knew that. But her legs wouldn't move. The warmth, the smell, the sight of all that food, it was too much. She tried to speak, to explain, but the German words tangled on her tongue. Her vision swam. Bitte, she managed to whisper, please. That word she knew. Just a piece of bread, please. Her voice came out smaller than she meant it to. Broken. The conversations around her died one by one as people turned to look. She felt their eyes on her dirty coat, her unwashed hair, her hollow cheeks. A woman at the nearest table pulled her purse closer. The man in the black suit touched her elbow, trying to guide her back toward the door. I'm sorry, but you cannot... Wait! A different voice, deeper with authority. An older man stepped out from behind a wooden counter. He had gray hair combed back neatly and wore a white shirt with the sleeves rolled up. His face was stern, all sharp angles and serious eyes. He looked like someone who didn't tolerate nonsense, someone who ran his business with an iron fist. He studied Elena for a long moment. She forced herself to meet his gaze, even though every instinct told her to look away. She had nothing left but her dignity, and even that was hanging by a thread. The older man's eyes traveled down to her hands, which she'd been unconsciously wringing together. He stepped closer and, without asking permission, took one of her hands and turned it over. His thumb brushed across her fingertips. Elena flinched but didn't pull away. She watched his expression change just slightly. The hardness in his eyes softened by a fraction. You play, he said. It wasn't a question. She nodded, not trusting her voice. He released her hand and turned to look at something in the corner of the room. Elena followed his gaze. There, pushed against the far wall between two large windows, sat a grand piano. Its black surface gleamed under the chandelier light. The lid was closed, and someone had placed a vase of flowers on top. The man looked back at her. You play for 1 hour, he said, his accent thick but his words clear. Then you eat. This is the deal. Elena's throat tightened. She wanted to cry, to laugh, to fall to her knees. Instead, she just nodded again. The man gestured to the other staff member, who looked confused but stepped aside. Then he pointed toward the piano. Go, now, before I change my mind. She moved through the room on unsteady legs. Every eye followed her. She heard whispers, felt their judgment. The refugee. The beggar. What was the owner thinking, letting someone like that touch their expensive piano? Elena reached the instrument and stood before it for a moment. Someone had polished it recently. She could see her reflection in the surface, distorted and pale. She looked like a ghost. Her hands shook as she moved the vase to a nearby table and lifted the lid. The keys stared back at her, ivory and black, perfectly aligned. It had been so long. Months since she'd fled the conservatory. Nearly a year since she'd played anything that mattered. She pulled out the bench and sat down. The cushion was soft, covered in deep red velvet. Such a small luxury, but after days of sleeping on concrete and park benches, it felt like heaven. Elena closed her eyes and let her hands hover over the keys. She could feel the familiar spacing, the cool, smooth surface waiting for her touch. Somewhere in the back of her mind, she heard her grandmother's voice. The piano doesn't care where you've been. It only cares where you are. She took a breath, deep and steady. Then she began to play. The first notes came out soft, almost hesitant. A simple melody from her childhood, something her grandmother had taught her before she could even read music. But as her fingers remembered their purpose, something inside her began to crack open. The music grew stronger. She moved from that simple tune into something more complex, a piece she'd learned at the conservatory. Her hands flew across the keys now, muscle memory taking over, and with the music came everything she'd been holding back. The fear, the grief, the crushing weight of loss. She played it all out through her fingers. Every bombed-out building, every goodbye, every night spent wondering if she would survive to see morning. The music became her voice, saying everything she had no words for. The cafe around her had gone completely silent, but Elena didn't notice. She was somewhere else now, somewhere beyond hunger and cold and fear. She was home. Elena's fingers moved faster now, pulling out melodies she didn't even know she remembered. The piano responded to every touch, every emotion. It had been silent for so long, and now it was singing again. She transitioned into a piece by Chopin, one of the nocturnes. Her professor at the conservatory used to say she played Chopin like she understood heartbreak. Back then, at 19, she'd thought she knew what that meant. Now she really understood. The notes flowed out, soft and aching. She could feel the room holding its breath around her, but she kept her eyes closed. If she looked up and saw them staring, she might stop. She might remember who she was now and forget who she used to be. Her grandmother had always told her that music was a language that needed no translation. When you play from your heart, she'd say, tapping Elena's chest with one wrinkled finger. Everyone understands. Rich, poor, young, old. The heart speaks the same everywhere. Elena poured everything into the keys. The music shifted again, becoming something new. She began to improvise, letting her hands create something that had never existed before. This was her story now, told in chords and rhythms. The fear of running, the cold of sleeping in doorways, the kindness of strangers who'd given her directions even when they couldn't understand her broken German, and the loss. Always the loss. Her mother's laugh, her father's steady hands, her little brother's questions about everything. All of it gone in explosions that still echoed in her dreams. The improvisation grew stronger, more urgent. Her hands crashed against the keys, then softened, then built up again. It was chaos and order all at once. It was everything she couldn't say out loud. Behind her, a woman quietly wiped tears from her eyes. A businessman who'd been checking his watch when Elena sat down now stared at the piano, his food forgotten. Even the staff had stopped moving. A waitress stood frozen with a pot of coffee in her hand, listening. The old man who'd made the deal with her, Herr Friedrich, stood behind his counter with his arms crossed. His stern face had changed. The hard lines had softened. He glanced around his cafe, seeing what the music was doing to his customers, and something like satisfaction crossed his features. In the far corner, a man in an expensive gray suit leaned back in his chair, his eyes closed. His name was Victor Hoffman, and he'd come to the cafe for a quiet dinner after a long day. He'd been in Vienna for 30 years, had attended countless concerts at the finest halls, had discovered some of the most talented musicians in Europe. But this raw, unpolished, desperate music struck something in him that hadn't been touched in years. Elena didn't know any of this. She only knew the piano and the music and the feeling of finally being able to breathe again. She moved into another piece, something Russian this time. A lullaby her grandmother used to hum while cooking. Simple notes, but played with such tenderness that it felt like a prayer. The hour passed like minutes. Elena's hands were starting to tire, her fingers getting stiff, but she didn't want to stop. As long as she was playing, she wasn't hungry. She wasn't alone. She wasn't a refugee without papers or future. She was just a musician, doing the only thing she'd ever been truly good at. But finally, her hand slowed. The last piece she chose was something she'd written herself years ago, when she still believed the world was mostly good. It was called Morning Light, and it was about hope, about new beginnings. Playing it now felt both painful and necessary. The final notes hung in the air, soft and fading. Elena kept her hands on the keys for a moment longer, not ready to let go. Then slowly she lifted them and opened her eyes. The cafe exploded in applause. Elena turned on the bench, startled. She'd almost forgotten there were people watching. They were all standing now, clapping, some of them with tears streaming down their faces. The sound overwhelmed her. When was the last time anyone had applauded for her? Before the war. Before everything ended, her own eyes filled with tears. She stood up on shaky legs and tried to bow, the way she'd been taught at the conservatory. Grace under pressure, her professor had said. Always show gratitude. Herr Friedrich walked toward her and the applause began to fade. He stopped in front of her, his expression unreadable. For a terrible moment, Elena thought maybe she'd done something wrong. Maybe she'd played too long or too loud or broken some rule she didn't know about. Then he smiled. It was small, just a slight upward turn of his mouth, but it transformed his whole face. Come, he said simply. You have earned your meal. He led her to a small table near the kitchen, away from the other customers. Elena sank into the chair, suddenly feeling every ounce of her exhaustion. Her hands trembled. Her head felt light again. Herr Friedrich disappeared into the kitchen and returned moments later with a tray. He set down a bowl of soup, steam rising from the surface. Thick vegetable soup with chunks of potato and carrot. Next came a basket of bread, the crust golden and cracked, still warm. Then a plate with cheese and sliced meat. A pot of tea. A small dish of butter. Elena stared at the food, unable to move. It seemed impossible that all of this was for her. Eat, Herr Friedrich said, not unkindly. Slowly. Your stomach will hurt if you eat too fast. She nodded and picked up the spoon with trembling fingers. The first taste of soup was so good it almost hurt. Warmth spread through her chest and down into her empty stomach. She forced herself to eat slowly, even though every instinct screamed at her to devour everything as quickly as possible. Herr Friedrich watched for a moment, then returned to his work. But Elena noticed he kept glancing over, making sure she was all right. She was halfway through the soup when a shadow fell across her table. She looked up to find the man in the gray suit standing there. Up close, he was older than she'd first thought, maybe 60, with silver hair and kind eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses. Excuse me, he said in German, then switched to English when he saw her confusion. Do you speak English? Yes, Elena replied. Her English was better than her German. A little. Good. He smiled and held out his hand. My name is Victor Hoffman. I'm a music producer here in Vienna. Elena shook his hand, very aware of how rough her own hands must feel, how dirty she must look. She wanted to shrink away, but something in his expression kept her steady. What you just played, Victor continued, sitting down across from her without asking permission, was extraordinary. I've been in this business for 30 years and I haven't heard anything that moved me like that in a very long time. Elena didn't know what to say. She stared at him, the spoon still in her hand. Where did you study? He asked. Kiev Conservatory, she whispered. Before the war. He nodded slowly, understanding crossing his face. You're Ukrainian? Yes. And you're here alone. It wasn't really a question, but she answered anyway. Yes. Victor leaned forward, his elbows on the table. I want to help you. I want to record your music. I want people to hear what I just heard. Elena's heart began to race. This couldn't be real. Things like this didn't happen to people like her. I have no papers, she said quietly. I'm not supposed to be here. I can't work. Let me worry about that, Victor said, waving his hand dismissively. I have lawyers, good ones. They can help with the paperwork, get you temporary status while we figure things out. What I need to know is, do you want this? Do you want to play? Did she want to play? It was like asking if she wanted to breathe. Music was the only thing she had left of her old life, the only piece of herself that the war hadn't destroyed. Yes, she said, her voice stronger now. Yes, I want to play. Victor smiled, the kind of smile that reached his eyes. Good. Then we start tomorrow. Elena woke up the next morning, still not believing it was real. Victor had given her money for a small room in a pension, a family-run guest house on a quiet street. The owner, an older woman named Frau Müller, had asked no questions when Elena arrived late the previous night. She just handed over a key and pointed up the stairs. The room was tiny, barely bigger than a closet, but it had a bed and a radiator that clanked and hissed but gave off wonderful heat. Elena sat on the edge of the bed, still wearing yesterday's clothes, and pulled out her grandmother's photograph. In the morning light streaming through the small window, she could see details she'd forgotten. The way her grandmother's eyes crinkled at the corners, the simple dress she wore, the pride in her smile as young Elena stood beside the piano. I met someone who wants to help, Elena whispered to the photo. I don't know if I should trust this, but I don't have any other choice. A knock on the door made her jump. Frau Müller's voice called through the wood. Breakfast is ready. Come down when you're ready. The small dining room smelled like coffee and fresh rolls. 3 other guests sat at the long table, and they nodded politely at Elena but didn't ask questions. Frau Müller placed a plate in front of her, buttered rolls with jam, cheese, a soft-boiled egg. Elena ate slowly, savoring every bite, still hardly believing she didn't have to worry about where her next meal would come from. Victor arrived exactly at 10, just as he'd promised. He drove her across the city, pointing out landmarks as they went. The Opera House, the Palace Gardens, the university where Mozart had once performed. Elena watched it all pass by the car window, trying to memorize everything. The recording studio was in an older building with high ceilings and large windows. Inside it smelled like wood and old paper, with something electronic underneath. Cables snaked across the floor, microphones stood on stands like strange metal flowers, and in the center of the main room sat a piano, bigger and more beautiful than the one at the cafe. This is where the magic happens, Victor said, spreading his arms wide. Nothing fancy, but the sound is perfect. That's what matters. A woman emerged from a back room, younger than Victor, maybe 35, with her hair pulled back in a messy knot. She wore an oversized sweater and had pencils stuck behind both ears. You must be Elena, she said, offering her hand. I'm Petra. I handle all the technical stuff so Victor can pretend he knows what he's doing. Victor laughed. She's not wrong. Petra makes me look good. Elena shook Petra's hand, grateful when the woman's grip was gentle and her smile genuine. There was no pity in her eyes, no judgment. Just curiosity and warmth. They spent the first hour just talking. Victor wanted to understand her musical background, what she'd studied, what pieces meant the most to her. Elena found herself talking about things she hadn't spoken about in months. Her first piano teacher, a stern woman who rapped her knuckles with a ruler when she played wrong notes. Her acceptance to the conservatory, how proud her parents had been, the competitions she'd entered, sometimes winning, sometimes learning. What about your own compositions? Victor asked. Have you written music? Elena hesitated. A little. Nothing serious. My professors always said to focus on the masters first. Your professors were partly right, Victor said. But that improvisation you played last night, that came from somewhere real. That's what people need to hear. Not just perfect technique, but truth. After lunch, simple sandwiches that Petra ran out to get, they moved into the recording room. Elena sat at the piano, her hands hovering over the keys. Suddenly, she felt frozen. This was different from the cafe. There she'd been playing for survival, for bread with nothing to lose. Now there were expectations. What if she couldn't do it again? Just breathe. Petra's voice came through the speakers from the control room. Play anything. Play scales if you want. Just get comfortable with the space. Elena started with something simple, a Bach prelude she'd learned as a child. The notes came out stiff at first, mechanical. She could hear the tension in her own playing. Stop thinking, Victor called out. Your fingers know what to do. Let them remember. She tried again, closing her eyes this time. The melody flowed a bit easier. The piano had a rich tone, each note clear and full. She moved into a Mozart sonata, then a Chopin waltz. Gradually, her shoulders relaxed. Her breathing steadied. There you go, Petra said encouragingly. That's better. Now try playing something that matters to you. Elena thought for a moment, then began the lullaby her grandmother used to sing. She'd never written it down, never performed it for anyone. It was just something between the two of them, played on quiet evenings when the world felt safe and small. As she played, the memories came flooding back. Her grandmother's kitchen with its blue curtains, the way the afternoon light came through the windows, the smell of bread baking, her little brother playing with his toy cars on the floor, her mother humming along while she prepared dinner, her father reading his newspaper, looking up to smile whenever Elena hit a particularly difficult passage. All of it gone now. All of it just memory and music. When she finished, she kept her hands on the keys, not ready to let go of that moment. The intercom stayed silent for several seconds. Finally, Victor spoke, his voice quiet. That was beautiful. Can you play it again? And this time, maybe add something. Whatever feels right. Don't think about it, just let it happen. Elena played it again, and this time, halfway through, her hands began to drift into new territory. She kept the lullaby as the foundation, but added layers on top, a melody that represented her journey. The fear, the loneliness, the cold nights, the hunger, but also the kindness of strangers, the warmth of Herr Friedrich's cafe, the hope that maybe, just maybe, things could be okay again. The music built and swelled, becoming something bigger than a simple lullaby. It became a story told in notes and chords. When she finished this time, her eyes were wet. From the control room, she heard Victor say something to Petra, his voice thick with emotion. Then he came out, walking into the recording room and sitting in a chair against the wall. Elena, he said carefully, what you just played, that's the heart of this album. That's what we need to capture, not just perfect performances of famous pieces, but your story, your truth. Over the next 2 weeks, they fell into a routine. Elena would arrive at the studio each morning. They'd spend time warming up, experimenting, trying different pieces. Victor pushed her to improvise more, to trust her instincts. Petra worked magic with the recordings, capturing every nuance. Between sessions, Victor's lawyer worked on her papers. It was complicated, he explained. The process took time, but they were making progress. Her talent helped. Austria valued artists, especially those who brought something unique. The studio became Elena's sanctuary. When she played, she forgot about her uncertain status, about the future she couldn't predict. She forgot about being a refugee, about being lost. She was just a musician, doing what she loved. One afternoon, about 10 days into the recording process, Victor brought in a journalist. A woman from one of Vienna's major newspapers wanted to write about Elena's story. Elena's first instinct was to refuse. She didn't want pity. She didn't want to be seen as a victim. But Victor sat down with her, speaking gently. It's not about pity. It's about showing people that refugees are humans with gifts and talents and stories. You could help change how people think. And maybe, just maybe, your story gives hope to someone else who's struggling. The interview happened 2 days later. The journalist, a woman about Elena's age, asked thoughtful questions. She didn't focus on the trauma, though they talked about it. Instead, she asked about music, about what it meant to Elena, about how it had saved her in more ways than one. What would you say to people who think refugees are just burdens? The journalist asked. Elena thought carefully before answering. I would say that we didn't choose to leave our homes. We left because staying meant dying, and we bring gifts with us, skills, talents, dreams. We just need someone to give us a chance to share them. The article ran the following Sunday. Elena's photo was on the front page of the art section. The headline read, From Bread to Symphony, One Refugee's Journey Through Music. The response shocked everyone. Victor's phone didn't stop ringing. Radio stations wanted interviews. Concert venues asked about performances. Other refugees reached out, sharing their own stories, thanking Elena for speaking up. Some sent letters to the studio, telling her she'd given them courage to keep going. But it was a message from Herr Friedrich that touched Elena the most. He'd sent a note through Victor, written in careful handwriting. I knew there was something special about your hands. Thank you for proving me right. Come back to the cafe anytime. You'll always have a table waiting." Elena stood in the studio holding that note and finally allowed herself to believe it. She wasn't just surviving anymore, she was living again. The album released on a cold Tuesday in November. Victor had decided to keep things simple. No big launch party, no fancy promotional events, just the music, released quietly into the world with Elena's story told honestly in the liner notes. "Let the music speak first," he'd said. "Everything else will follow." Elena spent that Tuesday morning in her small room at the pension, staring at her phone. Victor had sent her the link to where people could listen. She clicked it with trembling fingers, seeing her own face staring back from the album cover. It was a simple photo Petra had taken during a recording session. Elena at the piano, her eyes closed, completely lost in the music. The title sat above the image in simple letters, "Bread and Music." She couldn't bring herself to listen to it yet. Instead, she walked through Vienna, bundling up against the November wind. The city had become more familiar now. She knew which streets had the best bakeries, which parks were quiet in the afternoons, which tram lines would take her where she needed to go. She ended up at the Café Sacher, where everything had changed. Through the window, she could see the same elegant tables, the same chandelier light. The piano still sat in the corner. A different pianist played now, someone hired by Herr Friedrich to perform on weekend evenings. Elena almost kept walking, but the door opened and Herr Friedrich himself stepped out, taking a break from the lunch rush. He spotted her immediately. "Elena," he called out, his stern face breaking into a rare smile. "I was hoping you'd come by." Come in, come in." He led her to that same small table near the kitchen where he'd fed her that first night. The cafe was busy with the lunch crowd, but he waved away her protests. "You sit," he commanded. "I'll bring you something." He returned with coffee and a slice of Sachertorte, the famous chocolate cake the cafe was known for. Elena had never tried it before. That first night she'd been too overwhelmed, too focused on the simple bread and soup. "Your album," Herr Friedrich said, sitting across from her. "I listened this morning. The whole thing, start to finish." Elena's heart raced. "And?" He was quiet for a moment, his weathered hands wrapped around his own coffee cup. "My wife died 3 years ago," he said finally. "Cancer. It was fast, but not fast enough, you understand? I haven't cried since her funeral. I thought maybe I'd forgotten how." He looked up at Elena, his eyes bright. "Your music reminded me. That's a gift, you know, to make people feel again." Elena didn't know what to say. She reached across the table and squeezed his hand. The rest of that week passed in a blur. The album started getting attention, first from classical music blogs, then from larger publications. Radio stations picked up tracks. The story of the refugee pianist who'd played for bread captured people's imagination. Victor's phone rang constantly. Interview requests. Performance opportunities. A music festival in Germany wanted to book her. A concert hall in Prague asked about availability. Even a television program wanted her to appear. "It's too much," Elena told Victor one afternoon in the studio. "I can't do all of this. I'm not ready." Victor sat down beside her at the piano bench. "You're right. You can't do everything. So we choose carefully. We say yes to the things that matter and no to everything else." They decided on a small concert at a local venue. Nothing too big, just 100 seats. Intimate. Safe. The performance was scheduled for 3 weeks away, giving Elena time to prepare. But as word spread about the concert, something unexpected happened. The venue received calls from refugees living in Vienna. Could they attend? Many couldn't afford tickets. They just wanted to see someone like them succeeding, to hear music that spoke to their experience. Elena and Victor talked about it that evening over dinner at a small restaurant Petra had recommended. "What if we make it free?" Elena suggested. "Or not free, but pay what you can. So anyone who wants to come can come." Victor smiled. "You know, that's going to complicate things." "We'll have more demand than seats." "Then we do 2 shows, Elena said, surprising herself with her certainty. "One for people who can afford regular tickets. One for people who can't. Both matter." Victor reached across the table and shook her hand. "Deal. You're not just a musician. You're becoming an activist too." The next 2 weeks were intense. Elena practiced every day, preparing a mix of classical pieces and her own compositions. She worked with Petra on the technical aspects, learning how to use stage monitors, how to adjust to different acoustic spaces. but she also spent time with other refugees. Word had spread through the community about the concert. People reached out wanting to meet her to share their stories. A Syrian doctor who now worked as a taxi driver because his credentials weren't recognized, an Afghan family living in temporary housing, the daughter dreaming of becoming a teacher, a young man from Somalia who'd been a journalist, now studying German and hoping to work again. Each story reminded Elena that she wasn't alone, that her struggle was shared by thousands of others, that her success, however small, meant something to people who needed to believe things could get better. The night of the first concert arrived. Elena stood backstage, her hands shaking as she listened to the crowd filing in. Victor had decided to do the paying concert first, then the pay-what-you-can show the next night. "You're going to be amazing," Petra said, adjusting Elena's dress. Victor had taken her shopping for something appropriate. They'd chosen something simple, elegant, black with long sleeves. Elena felt like someone else in it, someone confident and put together. "What if I mess up?" Elena whispered. "Then you mess up," Victor said, appearing beside them. "That's what makes live music real. Perfection is boring. Truth is what matters." The stage manager gave her the signal. Elena walked out into the lights, temporarily blinded. As her eyes adjusted, she saw the faces. Every seat filled. People leaning forward, waiting. She sat at the piano and took a breath. Then she began. The first piece was Chopin, one of the nocturnes. Her fingers found the melody and the nervousness began to fade. By the second piece, she'd forgotten about the audience. She was back in that zone where only the music existed. Halfway through the program, she spoke to the audience for the first time. Victor had encouraged her to share a bit of her story, to make the concert more personal. 3 months ago, she said, her voice steady despite her racing heart, "I stood outside a cafe in this city, too afraid to go in. I was hungry. I was alone. I thought maybe my life as a musician was over." She paused, looking out at the faces watching her. "But someone gave me a chance. Actually, several people gave me chances. And now I'm here playing for you. So this next piece I play for everyone who's ever felt lost. Everyone who's ever needed someone to believe in them." She played her improvisation, the one that told her story. It had evolved since that first night at the cafe, becoming more complex, more layered. The audience sat in absolute silence, barely breathing. When she finished the final piece, the applause was thunderous. People stood, cheering. Elena bowed, tears streaming down her face. She saw Herr Friedrich in the third row, clapping with his hands high above his head. Frau Müller was there too, dabbing at her eyes with a handkerchief. Backstage, Victor hugged her tight. "You did it. You really did it." But Elena was already thinking about tomorrow night. The second concert. The one for people like her, still struggling, still hoping. The next evening, the atmosphere was different. The audience was more diverse, families with children, older people, young couples. Many had probably never been to a classical concert before. They clapped between movements, talked during quiet moments. It would have driven a traditional concert pianist crazy. Elena loved every second of it. She played the same program but added something at the end. An encore she hadn't planned. She played the lullaby, her grandmother's lullaby, and invited the audience to hum along if they knew it, or if it reminded them of something from their own childhood. The sound of 100 voices humming together, blending with the piano, filled the hall. It wasn't polished or perfect. It was messy and human and real. That's what music was supposed to be, Elena realized. Not just perfect performances in silent halls, but connection, shared humanity. Proof that even after everything, beauty still existed. 3 years passed like a dream Elena kept expecting to wake up from. But every morning she still woke up in her own apartment, a small but comfortable place overlooking a quiet courtyard. Every day she was still Elena the pianist, not Elena the refugee, though she never forgot where she came from. The album had opened doors she never imagined possible. Concert halls across Europe invited her to perform. She played in Berlin, Paris, Amsterdam, Prague. Each city welcomed her. Each audience listened to her story through her music. The reviews praised not just her technical skill, but the raw emotion she brought to every performance. But success brought complicated feelings. Sometimes late at night she thought about other refugees who hadn't been as lucky. People with talents and dreams who never got their chance, who were still stuck in camps or struggling to survive in foreign cities. Why her? What made her special? The guilt kept her awake sometimes, Victor noticed, of course. He always noticed. You can't save everyone, he told her one afternoon in the studio. They were working on her second album, a collection of pieces dedicated to displaced people everywhere. But you can use your platform to help. That's what you're doing, and she was trying. A portion of every concert ticket went to refugee organizations. She'd started a foundation that provided musical instruments to refugee children. She visited camps when she could, playing for people who needed beauty in their lives, who needed to remember that culture and art still mattered even in the worst circumstances. One spring morning, Elena received an email that made her hands shake. The Musikverein, one of the most prestigious concert halls in Vienna, wanted to book her for a full evening performance. This wasn't a small venue or a charity concert. This was the kind of place where the greatest musicians in the world performed. She called Victor immediately. They want me at the Musikverein. This has to be a mistake. It's not a mistake, Victor said, and she could hear the smile in his voice. You've earned this, Elena. Say yes. The concert was scheduled for October, 6 months away. It gave Elena time to prepare, but also time to be terrified. She practiced until her fingers ached. She worked with Petra on every detail. She lost sleep imagining all the ways she could fail. Frau Müller, who Elena still visited for breakfast sometimes, tried to calm her down. You're the same girl who played in that cafe for a piece of bread, the older woman said, pouring coffee. Except now you're not hungry and scared. You're strong. Don't forget that. As summer turned to autumn, Elena made a decision. She wanted to do something special before the big concert, something meaningful. She contacted Herr Friedrich and proposed an idea. Could she return to Café Sacher for one private performance? Not for a paying audience, but for him. To thank him properly for that first chance he'd given her. Herr Friedrich initially refused. You don't owe me anything, he said gruffly. I made a simple deal. You played, you ate. That's all. It wasn't simple to me, Elena insisted. It was everything. Please let me do this. He finally agreed, but on one condition. He wanted to invite a few other people. The staff who'd been working that night. Some regular customers who'd witnessed her first performance. Just a small group. The evening arrived in late September, a week before her Musikverein concert. Elena arrived at the cafe as the sun was setting, casting golden light through the large windows. The tables had been pushed aside to create more space around the piano. Maybe 20 people stood around, talking quietly. Herr Friedrich greeted her at the door. He looked older than she remembered, more gray in his hair, deeper lines around his eyes. But his handshake was still firm, his gaze still sharp. Welcome back, he said simply. Elena walked to the piano, the same instrument she'd played that desperate night. Someone had placed flowers on top, fresh roses in a crystal vase. She sat down and looked at the small audience. She recognized a few faces. The waiter who'd tried to escort her out. The woman who'd been sitting at the front table crying. Victor was there, of course, and Petra. Frau Müller had come too. 3 years ago, Elena began, her voice steady. I walked through that door with nothing. No money, no papers, no hope. I was ready to beg, which is something I never thought I'd have to do. She paused, looking at Herr Friedrich. This man could have turned me away. He had every right to. Instead, he gave me a chance. 1 hour of music for a meal. It seemed like such a small thing. But it changed everything. She turned to the piano. So tonight, I want to play for him. For all of you who were here that night. This isn't a performance. This is a thank you. She began with the lullaby, her grandmother's song. It had become her signature piece, the one everyone asked for. But tonight it felt different, more personal. She played it slowly, savoring every note. Then she moved into the improvisation, the piece that had become the title track of her album. It had evolved over 3 years, growing richer and more complex. But at its heart, it was still the same story. Loss and survival. Despair and hope. Endings and new beginnings. As she played, she thought about everything that had happened. The cold nights on the streets. The hunger, the fear, but also the kindness of strangers. The music that had saved her. The community that had formed around her. The life she'd built from nothing. The final notes faded into silence. For a moment, no one moved. Then Herr Friedrich stepped forward. His eyes were wet, and he didn't try to hide it. Thank you, he said quietly, for reminding me why I do this, why any of us do what we do. It's not about the money or the business. It's about the moments when we can help each other be human. He reached into his jacket and pulled out something wrapped in cloth. I've been saving this for you, he said, handing it to Elena. She unwrapped it carefully. Inside was a piece of bread, preserved somehow, sealed in clear resin and mounted on a small wooden stand. A brass plate at the base was engraved with words. "Just a piece of bread, please." Elena stared at it, her throat tight. "You kept it?" "I asked the kitchen to save one from that night," Herr Friedrich said. "I had a feeling your story wasn't finished. I wanted you to have something to remember where you started." Elena couldn't speak. She just hugged him. This stern old man who'd shown her kindness when she needed it most. Around them, people clapped softly. The week passed in a blur. Suddenly, it was the night of the Musikverein concert. Elena stood backstage in a beautiful gown, deep blue like the evening sky. Her hair was styled, her makeup perfect. She looked like she belonged on that stage. But in her hands, she held her grandmother's photograph and the preserved piece of bread Herr Friedrich had given her. These were her anchors, her reminders of truth. Victor came to give her the 5-minute warning. "Ready?" Elena took a deep breath. "I think so. I'm still scared, though." "Good," Victor said. "Fear means it matters. Now go show them what music sounds like when it comes from a real place." She walked onto the stage, and the applause washed over her. The hall was magnificent, all gold and crystal, red velvet seats rising in tiers. Every seat filled. Nearly 2,000 people waiting to hear her play. Elena sat at the piano, the spotlight warm on her shoulders. She looked out at all those faces and felt something settle inside her. This was real. She'd earned this. Not through luck or pity, but through her own talent and hard work and refusal to give up. She began to play. The music flowed from her fingers like water, like breath, like truth. She played the classical masters and her own compositions. She played grief and joy, darkness and light. She played her grandmother's lullaby and heard in her mind 100 voices humming along like they had at that community concert. She played her story, and in doing so, she played everyone's story, the story of falling and getting back up, of losing everything and finding something new, of asking for help and receiving grace. When the final note faded, the silence lasted for 3 heartbeats. Then the audience rose as one, applause thundering through the hall. Elena stood and bowed, tears streaming down her face. Later, at a small reception, journalists asked her about her journey. One question came up again and again. What would you tell your younger self, that girl who walked into the cafe? Elena thought carefully before answering. I'd tell her that the darkest moments don't last forever. That asking for help isn't weakness. That sometimes you have to lose everything to find out who you really are. She smiled. And I'd tell her to trust the kindness of strangers. Because sometimes all it takes is one person saying yes. One person giving you a chance. One piece of bread and one piano bench, and your whole life can change. That night, back in her apartment, Elena placed the preserved bread on her piano next to her grandmother's photograph. 2 reminders of where she'd been, who'd helped her, and what really mattered. She was home. Not the home she'd lost, but a new home she'd built with her own hands and heart and music. And that, she realized, was enough. More than enough, it was everything.